started with the current phase of the conflict in Ukraine. Orban is trying to do his best in order to bring NATO and Russia together to have some sort of negotiations, a political settlement. And what's your interpretation of the current phase and what's going on right now in the European Union, considering the conflict in Ukraine?
Well, I have been following this conflict in Ukraine from well before it became a war, and like many observers, I have been misled time and again over the last 2.5 years by the seeming closeness of a Russian victory, which, and by predictions that it's a matter of weeks before the end is in sight, only to discover that this was changed completely by a new escalation and new direction to the war that has been propelled by the West, so that Russia has responded, the nature of the war has changed, and the timing of its conclusion has moved like the horizon. And that's been the case. You have the Washington narrative, which is a pure propaganda, a narrative that is partly assisted by Kiev. Then you have the opposition or alternative media, of which I am a participant, and all too much of that has been cheerleading for Russia by people who very often know nothing about Russia and care still less about Russia, but see in this conflict a way of expressing their hatred for the United States and for its global abuse of power. I understand their repugnance at the way the United States conducts itself across the world, but I am a specialist in Russian affairs, and I cannot link arms with people who don't give a damn about Russia, people who speak about the conflict as if this is a walk in the rose garden, and the only victims are Ukrainians. No, there are victims who are Russians, and there are. But the numbers change. The estimates of how many losses there have been on the Ukrainian side have varied over time. Some people say it's 500,000. Whether that is a number of killed only, or it's killed and mutilated or taken off out of battle, out of combat because of their war injuries, nobody has a firm idea. And then you have Mr. Putin, who acknowledged maybe 3-4 weeks ago that the kill ratio or the elimination from the battlefield is 5-1 in Russia's favor. But assuming that 300,000 have been killed or taken off the battlefield, there's still 60,000 Russians dead, 60,000 widows and orphans. It is a very painful experience for both sides, even if it's much greater loss for the Ukrainians. So, but the people who are very often talking, commenting about this conflict, ignore this fact. They only look at the harm caused to Ukraine, how close it is to being annihilated, or however, whatever terms that are dramatic and emotive that they use. So it is a very good thing, a very good thing, without any qualification, that a person like Orban has immediately seized upon the opportunities that he sensed was there for him in days after taking the role of the rotating presidency of the European Council. I take my hat off to him. I've listened to his interview with Weltwoche, which was is amazing. I know something about Hungary. I visited many times on business going back to the late 1980s, early 1990s. I've had business associates there, some of whom I stayed in contact with, even though they loathed Orban because they were all like the pro-Soros types in Hungary. Nonetheless, I had a feeling for Hungary, and I know the man is not without his detractors and without some reasons for that. But there are no pure heroes in life. And I take my cue from who is doing the most good. And as of today, Mr. Orban is doing a remarkable job, an intelligent job of seeking peace, of showing up European bureaucrats for being just that, sterile individuals, hateful people. By that, I mean particularly the top leaders, like Charles Michel at the Council, or, of course, von der Leyen at the Commission, or Borrell at the Commission. For these people to have reproached Orban for his initiative is despicable. But I don't think that I have to add adjectives to descriptions of these people. I think it speaks for itself. And I think that it has to be mentioned as well that Orban is not only doing this shuttle diplomacy and going to the ends of the earth, having been in Beijing yesterday, today, and probably on his way to Washington today or tomorrow for the NATO summit. He's not only that, he and his close associates have been organizing within Europe a new bloc of patriots that is attracting some very important partners and which have a chance of giving a voice to the resistance to the clique around von der Leyen, who want to shut everyone up and want to dominate and monopolize power in Brussels and European institutions. He has brought in, most recently, yesterday or day before yesterday, Wilders' group in the ruling coalition in the Netherlands. He has the support even of the Czechs. The Czech Republic is a special case because of the division between executive and parliament over relations with Russia. Nonetheless, he had brought in parties in Czech Republic. He certainly has the backing of Fico in Slovakia. And you begin to see and he's reaching out to Meloni. You begin to see the shape, the contours of a group within the European Parliament that can put a stick in the mechanism that is leading us all on the path to Armageddon. For that, I have to salute the sagacity, not just the courage and the energy of Mr. Orban.
If you remember, before this conflict started, they were all demonizing Putin, Putinizing Russia. And it's all started with this concept in the West. Why do they really hate Russia? What's the reason behind this type of behavior on the part of the Western countries?
Well, the information war against Russia began with a vengeance in 2008, following Vladimir Putin's astonishing speech at the Munich Security Conference. And then you saw the American delegation at that conference was left speechless. They never could have imagined that they would be denounced for their bullying, for their brutal conduct of international affairs, as they were directly and to their faces by Putin at that conference. Washington was speechless, had nothing to say for a month or two, till it found its footing and began a massive campaign against Putin. There were publications in Foreign Affairs. There were denunciations of him. You had Yulia Tymoshenko coming out with an article there, which was intended to be a vicious attack on Putin. And that's where it started. And it's been accelerating ever since. So, but I take 2008 as a starting point. Of course, this developed within the States. In 2012, you had the first transfer of this media hatred and vengeance into actions with the passage of the Magnitsky Act that was so promoted by William Browder, a full-time Russia hater who enjoyed a lot of support in Congress. And that was the start. So 2012, this is 2 years before the whole Crimea adventure, that there was a pretext for really vicious sanctions to be taken up by Europe as well. In 2012, the United States began it. And surrounding this, you don't just have these sanctions in isolation, they have to be supported by further information warfare. And then you had 2014, let's say the takeover of Crimea, this reunification with Russia, which provided the context for yet another great escalation, widening and deepening the information war and the economic war waged against Russia. That took us more or less to where we are today. Why do they hate it? Because Russia has had the least to lose among all the potential adversaries of the United States on the global stage. You have China, but China's economy has been, until Mr. Trump began using his axe, his hatchet against the tree of Chinese United States economic bonds, until the Trump campaign against China. China was doing very well in the States and globally as the world's factory. And China had so much to lose by saying its mind about the nature of American hegemony and economic domination and parasitism, or rent collecting, as some people call it, globally. But China didn't dare act on these convictions. There are other countries who were similarly comprehending of what America is doing and how it was dangerous for the world. But again, they held their silence. By a combination of factors, Russia had very few economic bonds with the States. Oh, of course, we know that it has been a supplier of luxury goods and a supplier of uranium, enriched uranium, and at times of hydrocarbons, like certain petroleum products, which the United States was in one part of the country or another in need of. But in general, the level of US-Russian trade has been very, very low. This goes back a long way in history. It didn't just happen yesterday, because the two economies simply have little need of one another. Unlike the Europeans with Russia, which for them, Russia was a great source of raw materials. This is insulting to say out loud, but it didn't stop the French from saying that out loud, that they looked upon Russia as strictly a source of necessary and cheap raw materials. Other countries had their own interests in Russia, in its arms, and having a diversity of arms suppliers, not to be totally dependent on the United States. But generally speaking, the US-Russian trade was very low, and the Russian and America and Russia both had very little to lose in economic terms by going at one another's throats. So when Russia had enough of this denigration that it was receiving at the hands of the United States, of this condescending and scornful rejection of Dmitry Medvedev's suggestion of revising the security architecture of Europe to bring Russia in from the cold, going back to 2008, rejected out of hand by the United States and also by Germany. Russia then decided to say what it really thinks and to proceed with this alienation from the United States, which is proceeding today in front of our eyes in much more important material ways, not just information warfare. So Russia has been the single biggest obstacle to the American unipolar world. And going back 3, 4, 5 years, when the States was still speaking very disparagingly and insultingly about Russia's economy, going back to McCain and Russia being just a gas station operating as a nation. And Obama saying very much the same thing and adding insult to injury by pointing out that Russia was really just a regional power. This is a phrase which didn't just come out of the air. It's a phrase which goes back to 1997 and Brzezinski's Grand Chessboard, the notion that Russia is just a European state. It's another country that fits in a little box in Europe and is out of the way and doesn't cause any nuisance. And when Russia did present itself and its claims for security on the stage, the Americans dismissed it as being just a troublemaker that is on its way down. And I'd like to point out, without intending to detract from the expertise or importance of some of our major scholars like John Mearsheimer, this notion of Russia as a country on its way down was widely held by some of our senior academicians who otherwise are quite reasonable and informative and useful experts. But when it came to Russia, they weren't saying anything more insightful than you had from the worst propagandists in Washington. Power in the world, even by the realist school, was being defined in terms of GNP, and that was equated to be the same as military power. And since Russia only still accounts for 3% of global GNP, the notion that it could be a major player on the international stage and a major power, a superpower, was considered to be laughable. As recently as 3-4 years ago, the special military operation has changed that. 3 or 4 years ago, we heard about the United States as being the world's leading military power, and the second and fast-rising power is China. You don't hear much about China as the fast-rising power, except if they're talking about how many naval vessels it has compared to the United States. But in overall military strength, there are no fools who are saying that anymore, that Russia is in the distant lagger and that China's number 2. Most anybody who has his head turned on and screwed on right is saying the facts. The facts are that Russia is the world's second most powerful military force in the world. And in some areas, it's the first most powerful. And certainly in a traditional ground warfare, artillery production, and implementation availability, nobody has any doubts today that Russia is the world's biggest power. So this is where the military operation in Ukraine has changed the American and global perception. It's not a strange thing to say or to discover or to say that countries looking for allies or for partners look to winners. And they don't want to be associated with losers. And I think that we saw a week ago at the Astana meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that the Central Asian countries are solidly with Russia, and of course with China. China is the economic power, has much more to offer them economically, but for military security issues, there's no question that they are solidly allied with Russia. Mr. Tokayev, the remarkable president of Kazakhstan, who was a fluent speaker of Russian, a fluent speaker of Mandarin. It's not bad. He's just a president. He's not an academician. And he was wobbling this way and that way when the American diplomats came through his region. He's not wobbling anymore. And Mr. Blinken can pass through and they'll treat him to tea, but he is not making any progress in hopes of winning the minds and hearts of Kazakhs. The same is true of David Cameron's swing through this area less than a month ago. He came back with nothing. And why did this happen? I have not a moment's hesitation in saying, because these countries perceived that Russia is the winner in the contest against NATO. Countries like to be with winners.
How far is the West willing to risk Ukraine and the future of Ukraine in order to inflict suffering on Russia?
Well, I'm a very big admirer of Jacques Vaud, the Swiss military analyst, whose view of the war is very much in the terms that you just phrased it, that the West has no interest in the fate of Ukraine. Its only interest is in using Ukraine as a tool to weaken Russia. What the objectives are of weakening Russia, well, different analysts have different views. Some will say that it is to lessen the attractiveness of Russia to China, to help break Russia and China apart. Perhaps that's the reason. I think a much simpler reason is that by eliminating Russia, they prepare the way to attack an isolated China, which makes China much more vulnerable. So the reasoning here is, I think, pretty obvious.
Can we consider the conflict in Ukraine as a watershed moment in which that the face of the world has changed, and the way that we are witnessing the events in the Middle East, in Europe, in Africa, it's everything, it seems that is changing, and it's changing so fast?
Well, as there used to be a song about the head bones connected to the neck bone, the neck bones connected to the backbone, and so on. Everything, or as the BBC says in its promotional advertisements for BBC Business News, everything's connected. Indeed, all of these things that you mentioned are not disparate. They're all connected, and certain key players or actors are involved in all of them. And Russia is one of those key players. When you speak about the changing scene in Africa, particularly in French Africa, the departure or the kick out of the French colonial forces and the deconstruction of the French economic colonialism in these countries, Russia is present as a major factor, just as China is, to provide a sense that you can win the war against these former colonial powers, but you will not be economically destroyed by them. If Russia has been able to survive and even prosper in the face of the sanctions from hell that Victoria Nuland and her fellow conspirators devised in the State Department, then these countries also, if they have friends like Russia and China, have a very good opportunity to get out from under the heel of their former colonial masters. That's for Africa. For the Middle East, the fact that the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Ethiopia were brought into BRICS, forming a Middle Eastern core nations that have joined an organization whose mission is to establish a parallel world order, not to overthrow the existing world order, but in the expectation that the existing American-dominated world order will crumble when a viable alternative that is more democratic in the way it's governed presents itself. And that is what they're doing. That's why they joined. And that gives them a lot of confidence. A perfect example, one that I follow rather closely because I've been a frequent guest on Iran's press TV. I paid more attention to what's going on there than I otherwise would have. And what I see there is that there's much greater moderation. The victory of this so-called, so designated reformist candidate in the election a day ago in Iran is just another sign of it. But the man he's replaced after this tragic death of Raisi in a helicopter crash was, I think, incarnation of dignity. And dignity comes from self-confidence. And self-confidence comes from having powerful and well-meaning friends. And those two friends, in the case of Iran, are China and Russia. What I see here is an important element in the changing world is the approach of BRICS and of Russia and China to the whole question of what do you do with difficult states. The American view is simple. You turn them into pariah states. You cut off economic ties. You cut off diplomatic ties. You isolate them, shame them, try regime change in order to get them to submit to your will and to be good and upstanding members of the international community, in quotation marks. The Russian and Chinese method is, in a way, it's very close to what was used in Germany in its relations to Russia in the period of the 80s and 90s and up into the period of Merkel. This whole Ostpolitik of Germany that goes back to Willy Brandt had as the underlying logic or justification or explanation in any case to the German public and to European public that by drawing closer, you can have more influence and moderate the behavior of the country that you are in rapprochement with. I think that is a very good model. Of course, the United States has denounced this sort of approach. It has gone crying out to the world how it was misled by such thoughts when it gave privileged access to its market to China and allowed China to become its major supplier of so many manufactured goods. That China, to great disappointment of the United States, didn't become just like us. It didn't renounce its sovereignty, didn't kneel before the altar of the American Republic. But I hold the different view. I think that what the Russians are now trying to do with the Taliban in Afghanistan to drop all listing of the Taliban as a terrorist organization, to try to establish normal diplomatic, cultural, political, and economic ties to Afghanistan and its Taliban government. This is another instance where the policy is to normalize relations in the hope and expectation that you will moderate the behavior of the country you're approaching, rather than to cut off all ties in a very severe and destructive behavior that America practices.
When we look at Russia today, a country, when Putin came to power in 2000, 1999 and 2000, he was trying to get closer to the West, to the European Union, to the United States. But everything he was trying to do that, he was rejected. They were not willing to cooperate with Russia. Right now, with this conflict in Ukraine, it seems that Russia totally perceived that there is no way forward for Russia together with the United States and European Union. And they're doing everything right now. They're talking about BRICS right now. When we talk about BRICS, everybody's talking about China. China is the biggest. But it seems that Russia is the backbone of BRICS right now, because the way that they're leading in BRICS politically and militarily, they're having good relationship with Iran, with China, with India. Many of these countries don't have with Pakistan. And the way that they're managing right now within BRICS is so amazing to see, and how they're trying to do their best in order to bring all of these countries together.
I think this is a very big compliment you're making to Russian diplomacy, And I agree completely that Russian diplomacy is highly professional and very skillful in dealing with these very difficult countries and relationships that they have with one another, and not getting caught in the middle between their disputes. But I want to add, though, that the Russian diplomacy and Mr. Lavrov, for all of his experience as the doyen of major power diplomats in the world,